In the quiet dark, the past is never quite gone. It whispers from the peat-darkened water of the bog, where Iron Age kings, strangled and submerged as sacrifices, still surface with their skin perfectly preserved, their last meal of burnt grains still resting in their stomachs. It breathes from the great stone mounds that dot the countryside, tombs like Newgrange, built thousands of years before the pyramids, their inner chambers aligned to catch the first light of the winter solstice sun through a perfectly carved slit in the rock. This island has always been a place of deep memory and startling contradictions, a land that the Romans, those meticulous conquerors and catalogers of the world, named Hibernia, the land of winter, and decided, for reasons we still debate, to leave well enough alone. It remained a mystery on the edge of their maps, a place where law was not written on tablets, but memorized in epic poems, and where a king's wealth was counted not in gold, but in the number of cattle he could steal from his neighbors. The story we are about to begin is how this enigmatic island on the fringe of a dying empire would, against all odds, find itself at the very center of a new world. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments below, I'd love to see where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a quiet thrill to know where these stories are landing as you drift off. Our story does not start with a grand battle or the crowning of a famous king, but with the quiet, persistent rhythm of life in a place that time seemed to have forgotten. As the 5th century dawned, the mighty Roman Empire, that great bastion of order and straight roads, was crumbling. Its legions were being pulled back from the frontiers, including the wall in Britain, leaving the province vulnerable to raids from the sea. And the sailors doing much of that raiding came from the misty green island just across the water. To them, this wasn't Ireland, a single nation. It was a shifting mosaic of tiny, fiercely independent kingdoms, perhaps as many as 150 of them, each known as a tuath. A tuath wasn't so much a territory as it was a people, a group bound by allegiance to a local king, a ree. These weren't kingdoms in the way we might imagine, with castles and cities and tax collectors. A ree ruled from a large ring fort, a circular earthwork often topped with a wooden palisade. His great hall smelling of wood smoke, roasting meat, and damp wool. His authority rested on his ability to lead in war, to dispense justice, and most importantly, to be generous to his followers. Wealth in this world was four-legged and mooed. Cattle were everything, the unit of currency, the measure of status, the primary object of desire. A good king was a successful cattle rustler, leading his warrior elite on raids, known as a ta'en, against his neighbors. This wasn't seen as mere theft. It was a recognized, almost ritualized part of politics, a way of proving your strength and diminishing a rival's, a bit like a hostile corporate takeover, but with more spears and significantly more mud. Life for most people was tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of their livestock. They lived in small, enclosed farmsteads, their roundhouses made of wattle and daub, their lives governed by a complex and ancient legal system we now call Brehon law. This wasn't a set of written statutes handed down by a monarch. but a vast body of tradition and precedent memorized and interpreted by a special class of learned men, the Brehons, who were part of a larger intellectual elite that also included the poets, Feely, and the Druids. The Druids were the priests of the old religion, a faith deeply connected to the natural world, to sacred groves and wells, and to the shadowy realm of the otherworld, which was believed to exist alongside the mortal plane, its boundaries thin and permeable, especially at festivals like Samhain. They were the keepers of the community's spiritual health, presiding over rituals whose exact nature is now lost to us, leaving only echoes in folklore and archaeology. Historians still argue whether the concept of a single High King of Ireland, an Ard-Rí, ruling from the symbolic hill of Tara, was a political reality in this era, or a mythologized ideal created by later kings to justify their own ambitions. Power was certainly layered. A local Rai might owe allegiance to an overking, or Ruiri, who in turn might be a vassal to one of the great provincial kings of Ulster, Leinster, Munster, Connaught, or Meath. But in practice, a king's real power extended only as far as his sword arm could reach, and alliances were as fluid and treacherous as the surface of a bog. Into this fragmented, heroic, and isolated world, change was coming, carried on the very ships that raided the collapsing Roman world. For generations, Irish raiders, known to the Romans as the Scotti, had been harrying the western coast of Britain. They brought back gold, wine, and other luxuries, but they also brought back something less tangible: people, slaves, captured from British villas and towns, carried with them a new and revolutionary set of ideas. They spoke of a single, all-powerful God, a world beyond the local deities of the sacred groves, a faith that was sweeping across the dying empire. For a long time, this was just a trickle of strange foreign belief, perhaps whispered among the enslaved population. But among the thousands of captives brought to Irish shores to serve as shepherds and farmhands was one young man, a Romano-Briton of some standing, who was captured as a teenager. He spent 6 years as a slave, tending sheep in the lonely hills, praying to the God he had barely known in his youth. His name was Patrick, and when he finally escaped and returned home, he was not done with the island that had enslaved him. He was filled with a burning conviction that he had to return, not with a sword, but with a story that would unravel the fabric of ancient Ireland and weave it into something entirely new. The twilight of the old ways was ending, and a new dawn, carried in the heart of a former slave, was about to break. The return of Patrick was not the grand, instantaneous conversion that later legends would paint. There was no single moment where a nation of druids collectively decided to trade their sacred groves for stone churches. Instead, it was a slow, difficult, and profoundly clever process of adaptation. Before Patrick, a bishop named Palladius had been sent from Rome to minister to the few scattered Christian communities already in Ireland. But his mission seems to have faded with little impact. Patrick's great advantage was that he knew his audience. His 6 years of servitude had taught him the language, the customs, and the intricate social wiring of the Gaelic Irish. He understood that to convert the people, you first had to win over the king of their Tuath. He approached these powerful local chieftains not with condemnation, but with a proposal that fit their world. He offered a new, potent spiritual power, a God who was supreme over all others, and a connection to the wider world of Christian learning and prestige. Crucially, the new faith did not demand that the entire social structure be torn down. Instead, it found a way to weave itself into the existing fabric. The model that emerged was uniquely Irish, born of necessity and ingenuity. On the continent, the church was organized into dioceses, territorial units governed by a bishop who was typically based in a Roman-style city. But Ireland had no cities. It had no Roman-made infrastructure of towns and roads. So, the diocesan model simply couldn't be mapped onto the Irish landscape. The solution was the monastery, instead of a bishop's cathedral in a city centre. The nucleus of Christian life became the monastic settlement, often founded on land granted by a newly converted king. These were not just quiet cloisters for prayer. They were bustling, self-sufficient communities. They were spiritual fortresses, economic centers, and most importantly, schools. And because the land was often granted by the local ruling family, the position of abbot, the head of the monastery, frequently went to a member of that same family. This created a situation that would have seemed bizarre to a cleric from Rome. The abbot, not the bishop, held the real power. The abbot was the great landlord, the political player, the head of a vast spiritual corporation. The bishop, while essential for ordaining priests and consecrating churches, often lived within the monastery under the abbot's authority, functioning more like a resident spiritual specialist than a territorial ruler. It was as if the CEO of a major company also kept a master electrician on staff for a few very specific but vital tasks. It was within the walls of these monasteries, at places like Clonmacnoise on the Shannon, Glendalough in its quiet valley, and Bangor on the coast of Ulster, that an extraordinary cultural revolution took place. As the infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of barbarian migrations, its intellectual heritage was in peril. Libraries were burned, schools were shuttered, and the knowledge of classical Latin and Greek was fading from memory across Europe. But in this remote island outpost, which had never been part of the empire, a generation of monks became its unlikely librarians. In the scriptorium, the writing room of the monastery, a quiet and profound work was underway. Imagine the scene: a small, cold stone room lit by a single high window and perhaps a tallow candle, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, melting wax, and the sharp, earthy scent of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Here, monks sat hunched over slanted desks, carefully copying texts onto vellum, which was the painstakingly prepared skin of a calf. They copied the Gospels, the Psalms, and the writings of the Church Fathers, but they also copied Latin grammars, classical poetry, and philosophical works, the very foundations of Roman learning. Their work was slow, deliberate, and devotional. Each letter was a prayer. They did not, however, merely copy. They turned the written word into a breathtaking art form. The style that emerged, known today as Insular or Hiberno-Saxon art, was a fusion of Celtic traditions, the swirling, hypnotic spirals and knotwork seen on pre-Christian metalwork, with Christian symbolism and imagery from the wider Mediterranean world. A page from a great gospel book was not just text. It was a jeweled tapestry of interlacing birds and beasts, of geometric patterns so complex they seemed to defy mathematical logic, of human figures flattened and abstracted into pure design. The level of intricate detail achieved by these anonymous artists is staggering, the kind of obsessive perfectionism perhaps only attainable in a culture with a lot of rainy days and a distinct lack of other evening entertainment. Early works like the Kathak of St. Columba show the beginnings of this style, but it would reach its zenith in masterpieces yet to come. Works so beautiful, they were believed to have been made not by human hands, but by angels. This was not just preservation, it was a transfiguration. While much of Europe was forgetting its past, Ireland was busy illuminating it, ensuring that the light of learning, though dimmed elsewhere, would not be extinguished. While within the high stone walls of the monasteries, a quiet revolution of parchment and prayer was taking place, the world outside continued to move to a much older and more boisterous rhythm. This was the secular world of the Gaelic Irish, a society that ran not on Roman statutes, but on an intricate, unwritten code of conduct that had been passed down orally for centuries. This was the world of kings, clans, and cattle, and its operating system was the complex body of customs and precedents known as Brehon law. To a modern mind, it is a baffling legal system, primarily because it lacked two things we consider essential for justice: prisons and police. It was not a criminal code focused on punishing the guilty, but a civil one obsessed with restitution. Every person, and indeed everything, had a value, and justice was about ensuring that any harm done was compensated, that the fabric of the community, once torn, was meticulously stitched back together. At the heart of this system was a concept called the log en inek, or honor price. Every free person in the Tuath, from the mightiest provincial king to the humblest farmer, had a specific value attached to their status and reputation. This honor price determined everything: the weight of their testimony in a dispute, the number of followers they could have, and most importantly, the compensation due to them if they were wronged. An insult, an injury, a theft, even a murder was not a crime against the state, but a personal injury to the victim and their kin, an assault on their honor that created a debt. The job of the Brehon, the professional jurist who spent years memorizing the law tracts into poetic verse, was to act as an arbitrator, determining the exact size of that debt. The fine for killing a king could be astronomical, enough to beggar the killer's entire extended family for generations. The penalty for stealing a neighbor's bee skep was calculated with equal precision. It was a legal system that functioned like a staggeringly detailed insurance policy, where every possible transgression had a clearly defined premium for the perpetrator. If a man's dog bit a passerby, the law specified different fines depending on whether the dog gave a warning bark first. This society was held together not by fear of imprisonment, but by the bonds of kinship and the terror of social exclusion. Your kin group, your fine, was your everything. They were your co-signers on every social contract you made, and they were legally obligated to help you pay your debts and fines. Of course, this also meant that family gatherings could be particularly tense, as your second cousin's unfortunate habit of rustling pigs could end up costing you dearly. If a perpetrator and their fine refused to pay the compensation awarded by a brehon, There was no police force to compel them. Instead, the victim's family could legally seize property up to the value of the debt. The ultimate penalty was to be declared an outlaw, a person with no legal standing, who could be harmed or killed without consequence. It was a social death, a terrifying prospect in a world where community was the only true safety net. This intricate web of honor and obligation structured a deeply hierarchical society. At the top was the Ari, the king. Below him were the warrior nobles, and below them the foundation of the whole system, the boer, or cattle lord, the free farmer, whose status was determined by the amount of land and, you guessed it, the number of cattle he possessed. The ultimate prize in this hierarchical world was the high kingship of Ireland. While monks in their scriptoriums debated the nature of the Trinity, the great noble families were engaged in a centuries-long, often violent, debate about who should be the top king. The institution of the High King at Tara, as we remember from before, was more of a prestigious claim than a firm reality. In this era, the title was almost exclusively held by members of the vast and powerful Uí Néill dynasty, descendants of the legendary Niall of the Nine Hostages. They dominated the northern half of Ireland and their various competing branches, the Senel Neogen in the north and the clan Cholman in the Midlands, passed the kingship between them in a bloody and unstable rotation. Being High King didn't mean you ruled Ireland directly. It meant you were the most powerful king among other powerful kings, able to demand hostages and tribute from lesser rulers. And the primary way a king demonstrated this power, the central activity of the Irish political economy, was the cattle raid. The Tainbo Cuailnge, Ireland's national epic, is the story of a queen launching a war to steal a single magnificent bull. This wasn't hyperbole. It was a reflection of reality. A successful raid enriched your followers, impoverished your rivals, and publicly demonstrated your martial prowess. It was the engine of the whole heroic society, a chaotic, thundering ballet of shouting men and terrified beasts, the surest path to glory and power in a land where a man's worth was counted, quite literally, on the hoof. In the world we've just explored, a world held together by the sacred bonds of kinship and place, the most profound spiritual sacrifice a person could make was not to die for their faith, but to live for it in exile. The old Irish theologians spoke of three types of martyrdom. The first was red martyrdom, the familiar idea of shedding one's blood for Christ. The second was green martyrdom, the path of the hermit, who retreated from society to a remote cave or forest cell, battling their own demons through extreme fasting and prayer. But the third, and in many ways the most deeply felt, was white martyrdom, the peregrinatio pro Christo, or a pilgrimage for the sake of Christ. This was the act of leaving Ireland, of voluntarily severing ties with one's fine, one's lord, and one's homeland, to become a wanderer in a foreign land. To an Irish monk whose entire identity was wrapped up in their ancestral place in the world, this self-imposed exile was a kind of living death, the ultimate act of renunciation. And it was this powerful spiritual calling that sent waves of Irish monks pouring out across the sea, not as conquerors, but as pilgrims who would end up refounding a faith and a culture in a Europe that was struggling to find its feet. The archetype of the noble exile was Columcille, better known by his Latin name, Columba. A prince of the mighty Uí Néill dynasty, Columba was a towering figure in every sense: politically connected, fiercely intelligent, and profoundly devout. The traditional story of his exile is a perfect encapsulation of the era, a tale where the worlds of the scholar's cell and the warrior's battlefield collide. The legend claims that Columba secretly made a copy of a beautiful psalter, a book of psalms belonging to his former teacher, Saint Finian. Finian demanded the copy, and the dispute was brought before the High King at Deira, who delivered the famous judgment: to every cow her calf, and to every book its copy. Essentially, finders keepers wasn't a thing, and intellectual property rights were, surprisingly, on the agenda. Furious, Columba used his royal connections to raise an army, and a bloody battle was fought at Cúl Dreimhne, leaving thousands dead. Stricken with remorse, Columba accepted the penance laid upon him. He was to leave Ireland and never look upon its shores again, and he was to win as many souls for Christ as had been lost in the battle. Historians still argue whether this dramatic tale is literally true, or a later story crafted to explain a more complex political falling out. But whatever the reason, in 563, Columba and 12 companions sailed from Ireland in a small curragh. They landed on the tiny, windswept island of Iona, off the western coast of what we now call Scotland. It was a bleak, remote, and strategically brilliant location. From this rocky outpost, Columba founded a monastery that would become one of the most important centers of Christianity in Northern Europe. It was a beacon of learning and a powerhouse of missionary activity. Monks from Iona traveled deep into the pagan lands of the Picts, converting their kings and people. They sailed south to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria and founded the influential monastery of Lindisfarne. For centuries, Iona was the heart of a vast spiritual federation, a place of pilgrimage and royal burial, and a workshop that produced some of the most stunning masterpieces of religious art the world has ever seen, including, many believe, the early work on the Book of Kells itself. Columba, the sorrowful exile, had become one of the most powerful and revered saints of his age. If Columba was the aristocratic founder, his contemporary, Columbanus, was the uncompromising ascetic, the holy troublemaker. Leaving from the great monastery of Bangor in Ulster around the year 590, Columbanus was an older man, driven by a fierce, unbending piety. He and his followers traveled through the kingdoms of the Franks in Gaul, a land that was Christian in name, but whose royal courts and clergy Columbanus found to be appallingly decadent and corrupt. He was not the type to tread lightly. He openly condemned kings for their adulterous affairs and berated local bishops for their lax standards, making powerful enemies wherever he went. You could say he was that one brutally honest friend everyone is slightly afraid to ask for an opinion. His strict Irish monastic rule, with its emphasis on harsh penance and unquestioning obedience, was a shocking contrast to the more relaxed local customs. Yet his passionate zeal attracted thousands of followers. He founded a series of major monasteries, most famously Luxeuil in France. And when his critiques inevitably got him kicked out of the Frankish kingdoms, he made the arduous journey across the Alps into Italy. There, in the final years of his life, he established his last great foundation, the monastery of Bobbio, which would become one of the greatest libraries in medieval Europe. Columba and Columbanus were not alone. They were the trailblazers for hundreds of other Irish peregrini who established a network of monasteries, little islands, from Germany to Austria and beyond. These monks carried with them not only their learning and their art, but also their uniquely Irish customs, including their own distinctive way of calculating the date of Easter. This seemingly minor detail led to a major conflict with the authority of Rome, known as the Paschal controversy, which would simmer for generations. These wandering Irish scholars and saints, who had left their homeland as an act of supreme sacrifice, ended up giving an incalculable gift to the continent, helping to preserve the learning of the ancient world and re-sow the seeds of Christianity in a fractured and uncertain land. But while they were building their spiritual kingdoms abroad, the island they had left behind, a place defined by its internal struggles and monastic piety, was about to face a new and terrifying trial, a storm that was gathering in the cold fjords of the north. The end of the 8th century found Ireland in a state of dynamic, if violent, equilibrium. The great monastic centers were flourishing, their scriptoriums producing dazzling works of art, their influence spreading across Europe through the travels of the peregrini. The secular world, meanwhile, continued its endless dance of shifting alliances and cattle raids, a society governed by ancient laws of honor and kinship. It was a world that, for all its internal strife, was largely insulated from the great powers of the continent, a self-contained universe of saints and warriors. But that insulation, that splendid isolation on the very edge of the known world, was about to be shattered. The storm that had been foreshadowed was not a metaphorical one. It arrived on the tide, carried in long, sleek ships with dragon prows that cut silently through the coastal mist. In the year 795, the monastic annals record the first blow, the burning of the island monastery of Rathlin off the coast of Antrim. The age of the Vikings had begun. To the monks who witnessed that first terrifying assault, the attackers must have seemed like demons conjured from the sea itself. They were pagans, fierce, and utterly without reverence for the sacred places they plundered. In these initial years, they were known simply as the Northmen or the Gentiles, and they came primarily from the fjords of western Norway. Their devastating effectiveness was owed to a revolutionary piece of technology, the longship. These vessels were masterpieces of naval engineering, long, narrow, and light, with a flexible clinker-built hull that rode the Atlantic swells. Powered by a single, large, square sail and banks of oars, they were incredibly fast, but their true genius lay in their shallow draft. A longship could sail up a river for miles, deep into the heart of the country, and then land on any gently shelving beach, disgorging its crew of perhaps 50 or 60 warriors before a local king could even begin to muster his forces. It was the ultimate all-terrain vehicle of the early medieval world, rendering every coastline and every navigable river a potential front line. And Ireland, with its rich, undefended monasteries, was the perfect target. The very success of the Irish Church over the previous 3 centuries had inadvertently painted a giant bullseye on the entire island. Remember those bustling monastic settlements like Clonmacnoise and Bangor? They were the closest thing Ireland had to towns. They were not only spiritual centers, but also hubs of craft production, storehouses of food, and most fatally, repositories of immense concentrated wealth. All the devotion and artistry of the Golden Age had been poured into creating magnificent objects for the glory of God. Jewel-encrusted shrines to hold the bones of saints, intricately worked chalices and patens of silver and gold, gospel books bound in precious metals. To the Norwegian raiders, these were not sacred relics. They were simply bullion, portable wealth to be hacked apart, melted down, and taken home. It was as if a land full of banks had suddenly been discovered by a people who had no qualms about kicking in the doors, especially since the banks had no security guards. The Irish kings, accustomed to the ritualized warfare of the cattle raid, were politically fragmented and completely unprepared for this new kind of lightning-fast, profit-driven, and brutally sacrilegious violence. The shock and terror of these attacks bleed through the otherwise sober pages of the monastic chronicles. The Annals of Ulster, in a famous entry for the year 820, lament that the sea spewed forth floods of foreigners over Erin, so that there was not a harbour, nor a fortress, which was not overwhelmed by floods of Vikings and pirates. For the monks, this was an assault on the cosmic order. Their world was being torn apart by heathens who burned priceless books, murdered unarmed clerics at the very altar, and carried off their brethren to be sold in the slave markets of Europe. The psychological trauma was immense. In a 9th century manuscript, a scribe, while dutifully copying a Latin grammar, paused to write a short poem in the margin, a private thought not meant for posterity. It expresses a feeling of profound relief. Bitter is the wind tonight. It tosses the ocean's white hair. I need not fear the fierce warriors of Norway crossing the salt sea. For this anonymous scholar, a stormy night was a blessing, a brief reprieve from the constant, gnawing fear of the longships. For the first 4 decades, the raids followed a predictable pattern. The fleets would appear in the early summer, striking hard and fast at the coastal monasteries and those easily accessible by river. They would plunder, kill, and enslave. And then, as the autumn storms began to churn the seas, they would vanish, returning to their Scandinavian homelands to wait out the winter with their loot. It was a terrifying but seasonal affliction. But as the years went on, the Viking fleets grew larger and more organized. They began to probe deeper inland, striking at the heart of the great monastic centers. And some of their leaders began to realize that sailing all the way back to Norway every winter was perhaps a bit inefficient. A new, more dangerous thought was taking hold. Why leave at all? The hit-and-run raids were about to transform into something far more permanent, a presence that would change the face of Ireland forever. The logistical headache of sailing back and forth across the treacherous North Atlantic every year was bound to get old. For the Viking war leaders, who were nothing if not ruthlessly practical, the hit-and-run strategy that had served them so well for 4 decades was beginning to look inefficient. The real prize was not in seasonal plunder, but in systematic, year-round exploitation of this rich and poorly defended island. To do that, they needed a base of operations. They needed a place to repair their ships, store their loot, and shelter their men during the wet Irish winters. And so, they invented the Longfort. The name is simple Irish, long for ship, and fort for port or fortified camp. It was a ship camp, and this brutally simple innovation would permanently change the course of Irish history. In the year 841, the monastic chroniclers noted a frightening new development. The Northmen, for the first time, established heavily fortified bases from which they did not leave at the end of the raiding season. One was at Lyn Duachail on the coast of Louth. The other was situated at a strategic bend in the River Liffey, at a spot the Irish called Dublin, the Black Pool. This rough and ready camp would, in time, become the city of Dublin. We shouldn't imagine a city in these early days. This first Dublin was a military encampment, a forward operating base. It was a deep water anchorage for the fleet, protected by a defensive earthen rampart topped with a wooden palisade. Inside was a chaotic jumble of workshops for shipwrights and blacksmiths, rough halls for the warriors, and pens for holding the human and animal loot captured on raids. It was a pirate's nest on a grand scale, a place that stank of tar, iron forging, and human misery, for it was also the largest slave market in Western Europe. From this secure base, and others like it, the Vikings could now launch raids at any time of year, striking deeper into the Midlands with a terrifying new level of organization. It was less a seasonal pestilence and more like a permanent, grim resort for professional marauders. Yet, something entirely unintended began to happen. A military camp, if it stays long enough, needs more than just warriors. It needs merchants to supply it, craftsmen to repair its goods, and women and families to make it a home. These fortified long forts began to attract settlers, not just from Scandinavia, but from the wider Viking world, and they began to evolve. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were arguably the greatest traders and seafarers of their age. The camps at Dublin, and the ones that followed at places like Wexford, Waterford, Limerick, and Cork, slowly transformed from pirate bases into bustling commercial ports. This was a revolution. Remember that pre-Viking Ireland was a land entirely without towns or cities. The Irish economy was rural, pastoral, and based on kinship obligations and the exchange of cattle. The Vikings, almost by accident, became Ireland's first urban developers. They introduced the concept of the town, a place where power was based not on land ownership, but on commerce. They brought large-scale use of currency, at first chopped-up silver, known as hack silver, and later minted coins, into an economy that had run on cows. They plugged Ireland into a vast international trade network that stretched from Iceland and Greenland in the west to Russia and the Byzantine Empire in the east. Irish hides, wool, and unfortunate Irish slaves were now being traded for French wine, Byzantine silks, and walrus ivory from the far north. As the decades turned into generations, the settlers themselves began to change. They were a small minority in a much larger Gaelic population. They made alliances with Irish kings, often marrying into their families. The lines began to blur. The children and grandchildren of the first raiders grew up speaking both Old Norse and Irish. They took Irish names and adopted Irish styles of dress. They eventually, and perhaps inevitably, converted to Christianity. A new, hybrid identity was forged in these coastal towns, the Hiberno-Norse, or Irish Norse. They were a distinct people, urban and mercantile, in a way their Gaelic neighbors were not. Yet they were no longer simply foreigners. The family trees in these port towns became wonderfully complicated. A place where your great-grandfather might have been the Viking who burned the monastery. Your other great-grandfather was the abbot of. The Gaelic Irish kings, for their part, were forced to adapt to this new reality. The Longforts were a permanent threat, a cancer on the coastline. The annals are full of accounts of Irish kings launching massive assaults on Dublin, sometimes succeeding in burning the settlement and slaughtering its inhabitants. But they could never hold it. The Hiberno-Norse would always return, rebuild, and strengthen their defenses. The towns were simply too valuable as centers of trade and too easily supplied from the sea. A new generation of Irish leaders, however, began to see the situation in a new light. These Viking towns, with their silver and their ships, were not just a threat to be destroyed. They were a prize to be captured and controlled. The key to absolute power in Ireland no longer lay solely in having the most cows. It now involved controlling the flow of silver from the burgeoning city on the Black Pool. A great contest for the soul and sovereignty of the island was about to begin. By the middle of the 10th century, the political landscape of Ireland had become a dizzyingly complex and violent chessboard. The old certainties were gone. The great Uí Néill dynasty, who for 500 years had treated the High Kingship of Ireland as a family heirloom, found their authority being challenged on all sides. The Hiberno-Norse towns, particularly Dublin, were now formidable powers in their own right. They were kingmakers and mercenaries, their fleets and their silver for hire to any Irish ruler willing to pay the price. An Irish king might ally himself with the Dublin Vikings to attack his cousin in the west one year, only to find himself fighting against those same Vikings as an ally of his cousin the next. It was a chaotic, bloody, and opportunistic free-for-all, a perfect storm of political instability. And it was in this churning cauldron of violence and ambition that a new kind of leader would be forged. A man who would rise from a minor provincial family to challenge the very foundations of the old order. His name was Brian Boru. He was not born to this destiny. Brian came from a dynasty known as the Dal Cais, who hailed from Thomond, the area we now call County Clare. In the grand scheme of Irish politics, they were upstarts. For centuries, the province of Munster had been dominated by the powerful and aristocratic Eoganachta dynasty, and the Dal Cais were, at best, ambitious vassals on the fringe. Brian was a younger son of a local king, and his youth was not spent in a great hall learning the arts of diplomacy, but in the hills and marshlands of his home territory, waging a desperate guerrilla war against the encroaching power of the Vikings from the nearby city of Limerick. This brutal apprenticeship taught him everything he needed to know about warfare, strategy, and survival. It stripped him of any illusions about the heroic, ritualized combat of the past, and instilled in him a single-minded and ruthless pragmatism. The initial rise of the Dal Cais was led not by Brian, but by his capable older brother Mahon. Through a series of brilliant campaigns, Mahon managed to do the unthinkable. He defeated the Eoganachta and seized the kingship of all Munster for himself. Brian served as his loyal and brutally effective military commander. But their triumph was short-lived. In 976, Mahon was betrayed, lured to a supposed peace conference by rival Irish princes. He was handed over to their Hiberno-Norse allies from Limerick and promptly assassinated. For Brian, this was the defining moment of his life. The grief and fury at his brother's treacherous murder ignited in him an ambition that would burn until the day he died. This was no longer just about survival or provincial power. It was now about vengeance and the total destruction of his enemies. What followed was not a simple cattle raid, but a methodical campaign of conquest that revealed his military genius. He first cornered the forces of the Limerick Vikings and their Irish allies and crushed them in a decisive battle. He then stormed the city of Limerick itself, sacking the Viking stronghold that had terrorized his people for generations, slaughtering its defenders, and, as the annals grimly note, carrying off its gold and silver and beautiful foreign saddles. With his brother's death avenged, Brian turned his attention to his Irish rivals within Munster. One by one, he defeated the old Eorganachta nobility, breaking their power forever and securing his own position as the undisputed King of Munster. He was a new kind of king. He didn't rely on the traditional, temporary levies of freemen. He built a professional standing army of loyal soldiers and a large fleet of longships to patrol the River Shannon, beating the Vikings at their own game. His approach to diplomacy was similarly direct. You either submitted to his authority and became his vassal, or you were annihilated. You could say his method for resolving political disputes looked a lot like the final, bloody act of a revenge tragedy. But Munster was not enough. Once the South was secure under his iron grip, he lifted his gaze to the north. He looked toward the hill of Tara, the symbolic heart of Ireland, and to the High King who ruled from it, Mael Secnail Macdomnel, the head of the southern Uí Nail. Mael Secnail was no weakling. He was a powerful and respected ruler, the inheritor of a 5-century-long political tradition. He too had fought and defeated the Vikings, sacking the city of Dublin in 980 and forcing its submission. The contest that was about to unfold was a clash of titans. It was the old order versus the new, the hereditary, aristocratic king against the self-made, relentless challenger from a minor family whose curriculum vitae consisted almost entirely of successful hostile takeovers. Brian began his campaign not with a direct assault, but with a slow, grinding war of attrition. He marched his professional army north into Leinster and into Connaught, forcing the lesser kings there to break their allegiance to Mael Secnail and submit to him instead. The two great rivals began to circle one another, each testing the other's strength, in a long and bitter struggle for the ultimate prize, the mastery of all Ireland. The great standoff between the old king and the new did not end in a cataclysmic battle. It ended with a quiet, pragmatic recognition of reality. For years, Brian Boru had applied relentless pressure, peeling away Mael Secnail's allies, raiding his territories, and demonstrating his superior military strength at every turn. Finally, in 1002, the Uí Nail High King, seeing the futility of further resistance, did the sensible thing. He submitted. Without a single great pitched battle, the torch was passed. Brian Boru, the upstart from a minor Munster dynasty, marched to Tara and became the Ardrí, the High King of Ireland. And he was not just a king in name, as so many before him had been. For 12 years, He was the undisputed master of the island, the closest thing Ireland had ever had to a true national monarch. He was a whirlwind of activity, touring his new kingdom, demanding and receiving hostages from every provincial ruler, and enforcing a level of peace, Brian's peace, that the island had not known for generations. He saw himself as a new Charlemagne, and in a grand gesture of imperial confidence, he visited the great church at Armagh and had his secretary inscribe a note in Latin into its most precious manuscript, the Book of Armagh, proclaiming him Imperator Scotorum, the Emperor of the Irish. It was quite the promotion, but after a lifetime of brutal struggle, he had probably earned the right to a little swagger. But ruling Ireland, as Brian quickly discovered, is a bit like trying to nail jelly to a wall. While he was busy styling himself as an emperor, old resentments were simmering beneath the surface. The Kingdom of Leinster, in particular, had always been a rebellious and troublesome province, and its king, Mael Morda MacMurchada, chafed under Brian's heavy-handed rule. Mael Morda was also connected by marriage to the most powerful and independent force in his kingdom, the Hiberno-Norse city of Dublin, ruled by his shrewd and ambitious nephew, Sitric Silkenbeard. The final break, according to a dramatic later story, was a matter of personal honor. Mael Morda, visiting Brian's court at Kincora, was supposedly goaded into a fury by one of Brian's sons during a game of chess. An insult was thrown, the chessboard was overturned, and Mael Morda stormed out, vowing rebellion. The truth was likely less about board games and more about the cold calculus of power, but the outcome was the same. Leinster and Dublin rose in open revolt against the High King. Sitric knew that their combined forces were not enough to defeat Brian's massive Munster army. So, he embarked on a recruitment drive, using Dublin's vast wealth and his own extensive family connections throughout the Viking world to hire a truly formidable mercenary army. You might think of him as the mastermind putting together a crew for one last spectacular heist. He sailed to the Orkney Islands and secured the support of the powerful Viking Earl, Sigurd the Stout. He recruited fearsome warriors from the Isle of Man, led by a formidable figure named Brodir. This was not, it must be stressed, a national invasion launched by the King of Norway. It was a pan-Viking coalition of mercenaries and adventurers, tempted by the promise of silver and land, hired to support a local Irish rebellion against their overlord. In the spring of 1014, this grand coalition army gathered at Dublin, ready to confront the aging emperor of the Irish. The two armies met on Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, on the fields of Clontarf, just north of Dublin's walls. It was a battle on an epic scale, a brutal and bloody affair that raged from sunrise to sunset. The fighting was a chaotic swirl of personal combats and shield walls, a desperate struggle that saw a horrific number of casualties on both sides. Brian, now an old man in his 70s, was too frail to take part in the fighting himself. He remained in his tent near the edge of the battlefield, praying for the victory of his men. And victorious they were. By evening, the Leinster Viking coalition broke and fled. Mael Morda, the rebel king, was dead. Sigurd of Orkney was dead. The field belonged to the army of the High King. But as the rout began, a small group of fleeing Vikings, led by the mercenary Brodir, happened to run through the woods where Brian's command tent was pitched. They stormed in, and finding the old king at prayer, they cut him down. In the moment of his greatest triumph, Brian Boru was killed, not by a king in heroic combat, but by a fleeing mercenary in a random act of violence. The immediate result of the battle was a Pyrrhic victory. Brian's army had won, but Brian himself was dead, as were his son and his heir. The dream of a united Ireland, passed down through a Boru dynasty, died with him in that tent. In the centuries that followed, however, the story of Clontarf began to change. A brilliant and highly effective piece of 12th century propaganda, a book called Cogad Gaidhel Regalaib, or The War of the Irish with the Foreigners, recast the entire event. Historians now see clearly that Clontarf was essentially an Irish civil war, with Vikings fighting on both sides, but the Cogad transformed it into a simple, heroic, nationalist epic. The noble Irish, united under their perfect Christian king, fighting to expel the pagan foreign invaders once and for all. Brian was no longer a brilliant, ruthless politician. He was a national martyr who had laid down his life to save his country. The reality of Clontarf was complex and messy, but the myth was clear, powerful, and would echo through Irish history for 1,000 years. The myth of Clontarf ends with the death of the great king and the salvation of his country. The reality was far messier. As the sun set on that bloody Good Friday, the victorious army of Munster was left shattered and leaderless. Brian was dead. His son, Murchad, was dead. His grandson was dead. The command structure had been decapitated. The long, sorrowful march home from Dublin to Munster was not a victory parade. It was a desperate retreat. The Munster army, carrying the bodies of their fallen kings, had to fight their way through opportunistic ambushes as lesser lords, who had been cowed into submission by Brian's power, saw their chance to reclaim a little local prestige. The great unity that Brian had forged through force of will and military genius began to unravel the moment he drew his last breath. The power vacuum he left behind was immense, and the old familiar patterns of Irish political life rushed in to fill it. The first to act was the man who had been so pragmatically displaced 12 years earlier. Mael Sechnaill MacDomnail, the Uí Nail High King whom Brian had deposed, stepped calmly back onto the stage. With Brian's sons weakened and squabbling among themselves for control of Munster, Mael Sechnaill reasserted his claim to the high kingship and, for the last 8 years of his life, ruled effectively. His authority once again recognized by most of the northern half of the island. His return demonstrated a crucial truth. Brian's reign, for all its imperial grandeur, had been a personal achievement, a brilliant but fragile interruption of the status quo. He hadn't fundamentally changed the political system. He had just temporarily beaten it into submission. With his death, the system simply rebooted to its factory settings. A landscape of competing provincial kings, each convinced that they were the rightful master of the whole island. What followed was a century and a half of relentless, grinding political turmoil. The era is perfectly summed up by a term used by the Irish chroniclers themselves: the age of the Rí Có Fresabra, the king with opposition. It meant that for the next 150 years, no single ruler would be able to achieve what Brian had. No king could claim to be High King without a significant, powerful rival actively disputing that claim somewhere else on the island. The High Kingship became less a recognized office and more a declaration of intent, a prize in a bloody, perpetual game of King of the Hill. To claim the title was to invite immediate and violent challenge. It was like winning a magnificent trophy that came with a curse. The moment you held it, a rival materialized somewhere with the sole aim of taking it from you. The main contenders in this brutal tournament were the leading families of the great provinces. In the south, Brian's descendants, the Ua Brian, the O'Briens, tried desperately to replicate their ancestors' success from their power base in Munster. Men like Muirchertach Ua Brian were powerful and ambitious, controlling the trade of the southern port cities and even meddling in Welsh and Scottish politics. But they could never quite seal their grip on the whole island. Rising to challenge them from the west were the Iwa Conchobar, the O'Connors of Connaught. For centuries, Connaught had been a relative backwater, but under a series of ruthless and brilliant kings, most notably the great Dair Delbach Ua Conchobar, they became the dominant force in the 12th century. And in the north, the old Uí Nail dynasty, now represented by families like the MacLaughlins, fought ferociously to reclaim what they saw as their birthright, the high kingship that their ancestors had held for half a millennium. Leinster, as ever, remained the wild card, its kings skillfully playing the great powers off against each other, always ready to ally with the weaker side to prevent any one king from becoming too dominant. The warfare of this period was constant but rarely decisive. The goal was not necessarily to conquer and absorb a rival's territory, but to force his submission. A great king would lead his army on a hosting into a rival province, burning crops and villages until the local ruler came to him and submitted, handing over prominent hostages, usually his own sons or nephews, as a guarantee of future obedience. Controlling the Hiberno-Norse city of Dublin with its wealth and fleet was a key objective in these struggles. The kings would fight for years, exhausting their resources and their people, only for the entire balance of power to shift again with the death of one of the main players. It was this endless, draining cycle of internal conflict, this inability to establish any lasting central authority after the death of Brian Boru, that left the island politically fragmented and vulnerable, unaware that a new and even greater threat was slowly gathering, not in the fjords of Norway, but in the courts of Normandy and England. It is one of the great ironies of this period of Irish history that while the secular world was fragmenting into a chaotic scramble for power, the spiritual world was doing the exact opposite, as the kings with opposition spent their lives and their resources in a seemingly endless and destructive cycle of warfare. A quieter but far more profound revolution was taking place within the church. A powerful reform movement, driven by a new generation of devout and determined clerics, began to look at the ancient and unique structures of the Irish Church and see not a venerable tradition, but a disorderly and corrupt system that was dangerously out of step with the rest of Christendom. They decided it was time for a complete overhaul, a top-to-bottom corporate restructuring that would fundamentally change the nature of Irish Christianity. From the perspective of a reform-minded bishop in Rome or France, the Irish Church looked frankly bizarre. Remember the old system, born of a land without cities, where the great monasteries held all the power, where the abbot, often a member of the local ruling family, was the master, and the bishop was little more than a resident specialist for performing ordinations. Over the centuries, this system had developed some features that the reformers considered scandalous. The leadership of the great monasteries had become hereditary, passed down within a single powerful family for generations. The head of a monastery was often a layman, a secular lord known as a coab or erenag, the successor of the founding saint, who controlled the vast lands and wealth of the church, and simply hired a priest to handle the spiritual duties. It was the ultimate form of remote management, with the CEO inheriting his position and outsourcing the company's core business to a contractor. Furthermore, Irish practices around marriage, divorce, and the celibacy of the clergy were far more relaxed than the strict new standards being enforced across Europe by the great Gregorian reform movement, a powerful wave of change that sought to centralize authority in the Pope and purify the Church of secular control. The push for change came from both within and without. Influential Irish clerics who had travelled or studied on the continent came back with new ideas. One of the earliest voices was Gilbert, the Hiberno Norse bishop of Limerick, who was appointed the first papal legate to Ireland and wrote a blueprint for reform, arguing passionately that the Irish Church should abandon its barbarous local customs and adopt the neat, orderly pyramid structure of the Roman hierarchy. The real momentum, however, came from a series of remarkable native Irish churchmen. A key figure was Gaelic, the abbot and hereditary coab of Armagh, the most important church in Ireland. In a revolutionary move, Gaelic had himself ordained as a bishop, uniting the two roles and signaling that the old division of power was coming to an end. But the true star of the reform movement was his successor, Mael Maedog Ua Morgair, a man now known to the world as Saint Malachy. Malachy was a force of nature, a zealous, energetic, and politically savvy reformer who was deeply influenced by his friendship with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful churchman in Europe. Malachy fought tooth and nail to break the grip of hereditary succession at Armagh, and dedicated his life to imposing the new European standards, traveling tirelessly across Ireland and even making the arduous journey to Rome to petition the Pope. He was the kind of disruptive innovator who arrives at a venerable family business and promptly starts firing all the founder's complacent and unqualified descendants. This revolution was not fought on battlefields, but in a series of great national church meetings, or synods. The first major one was the Synod of Cashel in 1101, convened by the powerful King of Munster, Muirchertach Ua Briain, one of our kings with opposition, who saw a reformed and allied church as a way to bolster his own authority. This synod passed laws against secular interference and clerical marriage. But the true landmark event was the Synod of Rathbraceale in 1111. Here, for the first time, the reformers attempted to impose a national diocesan structure on the entire island. They essentially took a map of Ireland and drew lines on it, dividing the country into two great provinces, Armagh in the north and Cashel in the south, with 12 bishops under each. It was a breathtakingly ambitious plan, a direct assault on the power of the old monasteries. The final and decisive step came at the Synod of Kells in 1152. This time, a personal representative of the Pope, a cardinal named Barbaro, presided over the meeting. He brought with him the paelia, the woolen vestments that are the symbol of an archbishop's authority directly from the Pope, and bestowed them upon 4 Irish bishops. The diocesan map was redrawn and finalized, creating the 4 archbishoprics of Armagh, Cashel, Dublin, and Tuam, a structure that has remained in place to this day. With this act, the organizational revolution was complete. The unique monastic-led church of St. Patrick and St. Columba was gone, replaced by a national church with a formal hierarchy of bishops and archbishops who answered directly to the Pope in Rome. It was a profound transformation, bringing Ireland decisively into the mainstream of European Catholicism, but in opening the door so wide to outside authority, in looking to Rome to legitimize its new structure, the Irish Church had set a powerful precedent. If the Pope could send his man to reorganize the spiritual affairs of the island, perhaps another powerful foreign ruler might soon think he had the right to do the same for its chaotic secular affairs. Amid the grand impersonal struggles for the high kingship that defined the 12th century, the entire political landscape of Ireland was about to be tilted on its axis by a viciously personal feud. History, so often a story of armies and dynasties, sometimes turns on the passions and hatreds of a few key people. In the swirling chaos of the 1150s, the great contest for supremacy was raging between the High King from the north, Muirchertach MacLachlan, and his challenger from the west, Ruaidrí Ua Conchobar of Connacht. But it was a drama playing out on a smaller stage, a bitter rivalry between 2 provincial kings in the heart of the country that would provide the spark for a truly catastrophic fire. It was a story of ambition, humiliation, and revenge, a saga centered around a king's abducted wife. Our 3 main players were figures of fierce and formidable character. First, there was Diarmaid MacMurchada, the King of Leinster. Diarmaid was a deeply divisive figure, ambitious, ruthless, and forward-thinking, yet also brutal and widely despised by his own people for his tyrannical rule. He had a reputation for violence, even by the standards of the day, having once blinded 17 of his own Leinster nobles to secure his position. His great rival was Tighanan Ua Ruarc, the aging, one-eyed king of the neighboring territory of Breifne. Tighanan was a hardened warrior of the old school, a man whose entire life had been spent in the brutal cut and thrust of Irish power politics. And between them stood Tighanan's wife, Derb Forgaill, a woman who was a significant political player in her own right, the daughter of the King of Meath, and a prize in the great game of dynastic alliances. In 1152, at a time when Diarmaid's powerful ally, the High King MacLachlan, was in the ascendant, Diarmaid launched a major raid deep into Tighanan's territory. And during this raid, he took Derb Forgaill, along with her entire dowry, a significant mobile fortune of cattle and other valuables, back with him to his Leinster stronghold of Ferns. Now, for centuries, this event has been romanticized as one of history's great love affairs. Ireland's own Helen of Troy moment, with Derb Forgaill eloping with her handsome lover, Diarmaid. The historical reality, however, was almost certainly something far colder and more calculated. Historians still argue over the degree of Turb Forgil's consent, but they largely agree that this was first and foremost a political act. In the honor-based culture of Gaelic Ireland, abducting a rival's wife was the ultimate power move, a calculated act of political humiliation designed to destroy his public standing. And capturing her dowry was a massive economic coup. It was less a passionate elopement and more a hostile corporate merger, achieved through kidnapping the CEO's wife and liquidating her assets. Tiganan was incandescent with rage, but he had to bide his time. The following year, with the help of his own powerful ally, the King of Connaught, he invaded Leinster and forced Diarmait to return Dub Forgail. The feud, however, was far from over. For the next 13 years, the two men were locked in a cycle of bitter warfare, their personal hatred fueling the wider political conflict between their respective overlords. Their fortunes ebbed and flowed with the great tides of the high kingship struggle. Then, in 1166, the wheel of fortune turned dramatically. Diarmait's great protector, the High King Muirchertach Mac Lochlainn, was betrayed and killed by his own men. The power vacuum was instantly filled by his great rival, Ruaidrí Ua Conchobar, who now became the undisputed High King of Ireland. Suddenly, Diarmait of Leinster was left dangerously exposed, his most powerful ally gone. For Tigernán Ua Ruarc, this was the moment he had been waiting for. With the full backing of the new High King, he assembled a huge army and marched on Leinster to settle the score once and for all. Diarmait's own resentful vassals, the Leinster nobles who had suffered under his tyranny for so long, saw their chance and abandoned him. His support collapsed overnight. His subjects, it is said, were not just deserting him, but were probably offering him helpful directions to the nearest port. Utterly defeated and driven from his own kingdom, Diarmait Mac Murchada was forced into exile. With a mere handful of followers, he took a ship from the coast of Wexford, a desperate man who had lost everything. But Diarmait was not a man to accept defeat. His mind was already turning to a desperate gamble. He was sailing across the sea to seek military aid, not from some other Irish king, but from the most powerful monarch in Europe, a man whose vast domains included the neighboring island of England, King Henry II. The exiled king's personal quest for revenge was about to invite a whole new player into the Irish game, with consequences that no one could possibly have foreseen. The exiled king, Diarmait Mac Murchada, was a man possessed by a single burning objective: to reclaim his kingdom and destroy his enemies. To do this, he needed an army, and he knew the armies of his fellow Irish kings could never be fully trusted. He needed a new kind of weapon. He found his way to Bristol, the English port city that had long-standing trade links with Leinster, and from there took passage to the continent, seeking out the master of the vast Angevin Empire, King Henry II of England. The court of Henry II was not a fixed place. It was a whirlwind of activity, constantly moving through his domains in England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Diarmait, the desperate Irish king, finally caught up with the great monarch in his French territory of Aquitaine in 1167, and made his plea. He would pledge himself as Henry's loyal vassal, holding his kingdom of Leinster in fief, if the king would only help him to regain it. Henry was intrigued. The idea of extending his influence into the chaotic island next door, a place that had tempted English kings for over a century, was an attractive one. But he was also a man with a sprawling empire to manage, with rebellious French barons to suppress and a famously troublesome Archbishop, Thomas Becket, to deal with back in England. He simply didn't have the time or the resources for a full-scale royal invasion of Ireland. So, he made a shrewd and non-committal move. He gave Diarmait a formal letter, a littera patens, which was essentially an open letter of permission. It granted any of Henry's loyal subjects, be they English, Norman, Welsh, or Flemish, the right to assist the King of Leinster in the recovery of his lands. It was a masterpiece of royal ambiguity, the medieval equivalent of a parent signing a permission slip for a very dangerous field trip without reading any of the fine print. If the venture failed, it was a private matter that cost Henry nothing. If it succeeded, Henry could claim that it had all been done under his royal authority. Armed with this royal license to recruit, Diarmait returned to Bristol and began to hawk his proposition. He found his most eager audience not in England proper, but among the hardened, land-hungry Gambro-Norman lords of the Welsh marches. These were the descendants of the Normans who had conquered England a century earlier. A frontier aristocracy forged in generations of brutal warfare against the Welsh princes. They were a tough, militaristic, and ambitious bunch, constantly looking for new opportunities for land and glory. The first to sign on were a pair of half-brothers from the powerful and sprawling Fitzgerald clan, Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice Fitzgerald. But the biggest prize was a man named Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, a nobleman with a grand title but flagging fortunes, known to history by his formidable nickname, Strongbow. Strongbow was a man out of favor with King Henry, his lands diminished, his future uncertain. Diarmait made him an offer that was as revolutionary as it was irresistible. Not only would Strongbow get lands in Leinster, but he would get to marry Diarmait's daughter, Eoif, and, in a complete break with Irish tradition, be named as Diarmait's heir, the next king of Leinster. For a down-on-his-luck earl, this was like being offered the winning ticket in a lottery, where the jackpot was a kingdom. Strongbow agreed. In May of 1169, the first small contingent of this new alliance made landfall at Bannow Bay on the coast of Wexford. It was not a huge army, only a few hundred men led by Robert Fitzstephen, but what they lacked in numbers, they more than made up for in military technology and tactics. To the Irish forces that gathered to oppose them, they must have looked like creatures from another world. The core of their army was the knight on horseback, a human tank encased in mail armor and armed with a long lance, trained to charge in a disciplined, cohesive unit that could shatter any line of infantry. Supporting the knights were companies of Welsh longbowmen, archers, whose powerful bows could rain down a lethal storm of arrows from a distance, disrupting and demoralizing an enemy before the main charge even began. This was a new and terrifying way of war. The Irish fought bravely as light infantry with javelins, axes, and swords. Their warfare centered on the heroic charge and individual prowess. They were utterly unprepared for the disciplined, combined arms tactics of a professional Norman army. The invaders didn't waste any time. Joined by Diarmait and his own small band of loyal Leinster followers, they marched on the nearby Hiberno-Norse walled town of Wexford. The town's defenders put up a fierce resistance, but they were overwhelmed by the professional assault of the Norman soldiers. After 2 days, Wexford surrendered. In a single, swift campaign, Diarmait had a spectacular victory, and his foreign allies had a secure, fortified port on the Irish coast. The initial phase of the desperate king's gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But in inviting these supremely efficient and land-hungry warriors into his kingdom, Diarmait had opened a door that would prove impossible to close, unleashing a force that neither he nor any other Irish king would be able to control. The initial success of the first Norman freebooters was only the beginning. In August of 1170, the main investor in Diarmait's enterprise, Richard Strongbow de Clare, arrived to claim his stake. He landed near the Hiberno-Norse city of Waterford with a formidable force of some 200 knights and 1,000 other soldiers. He was not a mere adventurer. He was a serious general, and he immediately laid siege to the city. The assault was brutal and efficient. The defenders fought bravely, but the Norman tactics were overwhelming, and the city soon fell in a storm of violence. True to his word, Diarmait arrived soon after, and his daughter Arweife was married to Strongbow amidst the smoking ruins of the captured town. From Waterford, the combined army marched north towards the greatest prize in all of Ireland, the city of Dublin. The High King, Ruaidrí Ua Conchobair, tried to block their path, but his army was outmaneuvered. The Normans laid siege to Dublin, and after negotiations broke down, a small party of knights stormed the walls and took the city in a surprise attack, forcing its Hiberno-Norse ruler to flee by sea. Then, in May of 1171, the man who had started it all, Diarmait Macmuchada, died suddenly. In that moment, the entire nature of the invasion changed. Strongbow, through his marriage to Eoif, now laid claim to the entire kingdom of Leinster, not as a vassal to some Irish overking, but as its lord in his own right by the Norman laws of inheritance. This was the political earthquake. It was one thing for a band of foreign mercenaries to help an Irish king regain his throne. It was another thing entirely for one of those mercenaries to become an Irish king himself. The remaining Irish rulers, led by High King Ruaidrí, united against this unprecedented threat and laid siege to Strongbow in Dublin. But even their combined might could not dislodge the determined Norman garrison, who eventually broke the siege with a desperate and brilliant cavalry charge. News of these astonishing events was traveling back across the sea to King Henry II. And Henry was not amused. He was incandescent with rage. The reports he was receiving sounded less like a small-scale military assistance program, and more like one of his own disgruntled barons was successfully carving out an independent kingdom for himself, right on his doorstep. It was like a CEO discovering that a mid-level manager, on an unsanctioned side project, had managed to build a hugely profitable new company and was about to declare himself a rival CEO. An independent Norman state in Ireland, ruled by a powerful and ambitious man like Strongbow, was a direct threat to Henry's own authority. He acted swiftly, placing an embargo on all travel and trade to Ireland, and ordering all of his subjects currently there, including Strongbow, to return immediately or face the confiscation of all their lands in England and Wales. When Strongbow, playing for time, failed to comply, Henry decided he had no choice but to intervene personally and with overwhelming force. In October of 1171, he assembled one of the largest fleets of its day and sailed from England to Ireland. His army was immense, comprising at least 500 knights and some 4,000 archers and men-at-arms. But it's crucial to understand the primary objective of this royal invasion. Henry's main target was not the High King of Ireland. His main target was Richard de Clare. His goal was not to conquer the Gaelic Irish, but to bring his own dangerously successful subjects to heel. It was a massive, expensive, and terrifying exercise in reminding everyone exactly who was the boss. The moment Henry's fleet appeared off the coast of Waterford, the game was up for Strongbow. He immediately rode out to meet the king, surrendered unconditionally, and placed all of his conquests, including the cities of Dublin and Waterford and the entire kingdom of Leinster, at the king's feet. Henry, his authority now asserted, then played the magnanimous overlord. He formally took possession of the cities for himself as royal property, and then granted the rest of Leinster back to Strongbow, but now as a fief, a territory held from the king in exchange for loyalty and military service. The other Norman lords quickly followed suit, submitting to Henry and having their new Irish lands regularized under his feudal authority. Then, something even more remarkable happened. One by one, the Irish kings and chieftains began to arrive at Henry's court to submit to him as well. From their perspective, this was a logical strategic move. Faced with the choice between the rapacious, land-hungry Norman adventurers who were already on their lands and a distant, mighty king who might be able to control them, they chose the king. It was a classic case of better the devil you don't know, a gamble that this powerful monarch would prove to be a more reasonable overlord than the local warlords. To legitimize his actions on the world stage, Henry proclaimed that he came with the blessing of the Pope to continue the great work of reforming the Irish Church. Historians still argue about whether the key papal document he cited, a bull called Laudabiliter, was genuine or a clever forgery. But the effect was the same. Henry II had arrived, and with his arrival, the Lordship of Ireland was born, binding the two islands together in a new and fateful relationship. When King Henry II sailed from Wexford in the spring of 1172, he left behind a situation that was fundamentally changed, yet far from resolved. He had successfully imposed his authority on his own barons and had received the submission of many Irish kings, establishing the constitutional framework for a new Lordship of Ireland. He hadn't conquered the island, nor had he intended to. Instead, he initiated a policy of strategic containment. He confirmed Strongbow as the Lord of Leinster. But to counterbalance this power, he granted the entire former kingdom of Meath to another of his trusted and notoriously tough barons, Hugh de Lacy. By setting up these two powerful figures as rivals, Henry ensured that no single Norman lord could grow powerful enough to challenge the crown. The king was gone, but his men were there to stay. And they now began the slow, methodical process of turning their speculative land grants into reality, a process that would be written on the landscape in earth timber, and stone. The primary instrument of this colonial expansion was the castle. The Gaelic Irish, of course, had their own fortifications, the ring forts and crannogs that had dotted the countryside for centuries. But these were largely defensive enclosures designed to protect a chieftain's family and cattle during a raid. The Norman castle was something entirely different. It was an offensive weapon, a tool of occupation and domination. The first wave of these was the Mort and Bailey. This was a brilliantly effective, prefabricated design that could be erected with remarkable speed. A medieval version of a flat-pack fortress. A deep circular ditch would be dug, and the earth from it would be piled up into a tall, steep-sided conical hill called the Mort. On top of this commanding position, a wooden tower was built, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding territory. At the foot of the Mort was a larger enclosed area, the Bailey, protected by another ditch and a timber palisade. This would house the stables, barracks, and workshops. Using forced local labor, a Norman lord could throw up a functional Mort and Bailey in a matter of weeks, creating a secure base of operations deep within hostile territory. From this fortified headquarters, a small garrison of knights and archers could terrorize and control the surrounding countryside for miles in every direction, enforcing the collection of taxes and rents and crushing any local resistance. As Norman control over a region solidified, these temporary earth and timber structures were replaced with something far more imposing and permanent: the Great Stone Castle. Across Leinster, Meath, and Munster, the landscape began to be punctuated by these alien and intimidating structures. They were symbols of a new, seemingly invincible power. Hugh de Lacy's great fortress at Trim in Meath is the ultimate example. What began as a Mort and Bailey was transformed over the decades into the largest Norman castle in Ireland. A colossal stone keep with 20 sides, 3 stories high, surrounded by a massive curtain wall with formidable gatehouses and towers. To a local Gaelic farmer whose own dwelling was made of wattle and daub, the sight of one of these immense, geometric fortresses rising from the landscape must have been utterly demoralizing, a clear and brutal statement about who was now in charge. These castles were the stone anchors of a new feudal society. The great lords like Strongbow and de Lacy, who held their vast territories, known as liberties, directly from the king, were like the CEOs of their own little startup kingdoms. They, in turn, granted smaller parcels of their land, known as manors, to the knights who had fought for them. Each of these knights became a local lord, often building a smaller stone tower house or hall of his own, from which he administered his personal estate. To work the land, the Normans encouraged a wave of immigration from their estates in England and Wales. Thousands of English and Welsh peasants and tradesmen crossed the sea, seeking new opportunities. They established manorial villages, farmed the land in the open field strip system common in England, set up markets and boroughs, and built their own small stone parish churches in the new Romanesque and Gothic styles. In the east and south of Ireland, the very look and sound of the country began to change. Forests were cleared for agriculture. New roads were built connecting the castles and towns, and the English language began to be heard alongside Irish and Norse. This new colonial order, however, was a veneer. a network of castles and manors imposed upon a land that was far from empty and far from conquered. The reach of Norman power was directly proportional to how far a knight could ride from his castle and back in a day. Beyond that line, in the dense woods, the trackless bogs, and the high mountain valleys, the Gaelic Irish world remained intact. The Irish kings and chieftains had been shocked and overwhelmed by the initial Norman onslaught, but they were a people with a proud and ancient military tradition. They were not defeated, and as the first generation of Norman settlement began to take root, the Gaelic lords were watching, learning, and adapting their own methods of warfare. The conquest was incomplete, and a long and bitter struggle for the control of the island was about to begin. The great stone castles of the Normans were monuments to a new and formidable power, but they were also islands of colonial control in a vast and restless Gaelic sea. The new lords had successfully seized the richest lands in the east and south, the fertile river valleys and coastal plains that were easiest to farm and to dominate with heavy cavalry. But Ireland is not a land of open plains. Beyond the well-defended manors and walled towns, the country rose into mist-shrouded mountains, dissolved into vast, trackless bogs, and thickened into dense, ancient woodlands. And in these territories, the Gaelic Irish kings and their people were not only surviving, but they were adapting, regrouping, and learning how to fight back. The initial shock of the invasion, the terror of the mounted knight and the disciplined archer, was beginning to wear off, replaced by a grim and stubborn determination to resist. The first and most important lesson the Irish learned was to stop fighting the Normans on their own terms. To meet a charge of heavy cavalry in an open field was, as they had discovered at great cost, a recipe for disaster. So they changed the battlefield. They began to use their intimate knowledge of the landscape as a weapon, luring the heavily armored and cumbersome Norman knights into narrow wooded passes, treacherous bogs, and rocky hillsides where their horses were useless and their formations were broken. The Gaelic fight back became a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. It was a war of ambushes and lightning raids, of skirmishes and retreats. Instead of seeking decisive battles, Irish war bands would sweep down from the hills to burn the crops of a Norman manor, drive off the cattle, and then melt back into the wilderness before the garrison of the local castle could respond. It was a strategy of economic attrition, designed to make the colonial settlements so unprofitable and so dangerous that they would eventually be abandoned. To bolster their military capabilities, the Irish lords also began to import a new and devastating type of soldier. These were the famous Galloglass, or Galloglay, which means foreign soldiers. They were elite, professional mercenaries, recruited from the Norse Gaelic clans of the Western Isles of Scotland. A Galloglass warrior was a truly intimidating sight, tall and powerfully built, clad in a long coat of mail, often wearing an iron helmet and wielding a fearsome, long-hafted spathax or a massive two-handed sword. They were heavy infantry of the highest caliber, providing the Gaelic armies with a solid, disciplined core that could withstand a Norman charge and hold a defensive line. They were highly paid, highly prized, and utterly loyal to whichever lord was currently paying their wages. The medieval equivalent of hiring an elite private military contractor. These formidable axemen were supported by the native Irish light infantry, the Kern, who were fast-moving skirmishers armed with javelins and swords, perfect for harassing the enemy and fighting in difficult terrain. This growing military resistance was mirrored by a political reality that even the English crown had to acknowledge. In 1175, King Henry II met with representatives of the High King, Ruaidrí Ua Conchobar, and signed the Treaty of Windsor. This remarkable document was, in effect, a formal admission that the Norman conquest was incomplete. The treaty recognized Henry as the overlord of the entire island, but it also recognized Ruaidrí as the king of all the unconquered parts of Ireland, basically Connaught, Ulster, and parts of Munster, so long as he paid a tribute of cattle hides to the English king. It was a peace treaty that drew a line on the map, formally acknowledging the existence of two spheres of influence, the Norman colony and the unconquered Gaelic lands. The result of this military adaptation and political stalemate was that the Norman project in Ireland stalled. The initial lightning-fast conquest had run out of steam. The Norman lords found themselves in a deeply uncomfortable position. They had seized a huge and valuable estate, but they discovered that the very angry, very well-armed previous owners were still living in half the house, had barricaded the upstairs rooms, and were making constant, unnerving raids on the kitchen. The colony was a narrow, contested strip of land, a frontier known as a march, which was the scene of constant, low-level warfare. The dream of a swift and total conquest of Ireland was over. It had been replaced by the grim reality of a long, brutal war of attrition, a struggle between two cultures and two ways of life that would now shape the destiny of the island for centuries to come. The stalemate that ended the first great wave of Norman expansion did more than just halt a military campaign. It carved Ireland in two. The line drawn on the map by the Treaty of Windsor was more than just a political boundary. It was the formal recognition of a deep cultural and social chasm that was now hardening across the landscape. For the next century and a half, the story of Ireland would be the story of these two worlds, existing side by side in a state of near permanent tension and hostility. On one side was the Anglo-Norman colony, the land of peace, as its administrators hopefully called it, a world of castles, manors, and English law. On the other was Gaelic Ireland, the unconquered land of war, a world of clans, poets, and Brehon law. Within the colonial territory, a new administration, designed as a miniature version of the English state, was established. At its head was the justiciar, the king's personal representative and chief governor, who ruled from the newly built and heavily fortified Dublin Castle. A separate Irish exchequer was set up to handle the lordship's finances, and a system of counties with sheriffs and royal courts was gradually implemented to administer justice according to the principles of English common law. A parliament modelled on the one in England and attended by the great lords, bishops, and representatives of the colonial towns began to meet in Dublin to pass laws for the governance of the colony. From the king's perspective in London, the lordship of Ireland was meant to be an orderly, profitable, and self-sufficient part of his wider empire. But the key feature of this new legal and political system was its exclusivity. English law, with all its rights and protections, was for the English colonists only. The Gaelic Irish, even those living peacefully within the territory of the colony, were considered to be outside the law. Legally, they were the Irish enemy. This had profound and often brutal consequences. For an English colonist to kill an Irish man or woman was not considered a felony like murder, because the victim was not technically a subject of the king. The act was treated as a mere trespass, for which the killer might have to pay a compensation fine to the victim's English lord, if they had one, but they could not be criminally prosecuted. It was a legal system that came with a massive asterisk and a set of terms and conditions that basically excluded the majority of the population. There was, however, one famous exception. By a special royal grant, 5 Gaelic royal families, the O'Neills of Ulster, the O'Connors of Connaught, the O'Briens of Thomond, the O'Malaglans of Meath, and the MacMurrows of Leinster, were granted the full rights and protections of English law. The very existence of this tiny, privileged group, known as the Quinque Sanguine, or Five Bloods, only served to highlight the legally defenseless position of everyone else. Beyond the shifting frontier of the colony, Gaelic Ireland carried on. Here, society was not governed by the decrees of a distant king and his parliament, but by the intricate, ancient customs of Brehon law. Power was decentralized, residing with the chieftains of the great family groupings or clans. The professional learned classes of the poets and the jurists continued to be revered. Their role to memorize the genealogies and laws that upheld the social order. This was a world that, while politically fragmented and engaged in its own internal power struggles, was culturally vibrant and united in its general hostility towards the newcomers. Between these two worlds lay the frontier, the violent and unstable Marcher lands. Life on the march was a precarious business, and the Norman lords who held these territories had to become a special breed of survivor. They were often semi-independent of the Dublin government, ruling their lands like petty kings. They had to be bilingual and bicultural, adopting Gaelic customs and even styles of warfare to survive. They were like overworked sheriffs in a perpetually lawless frontier town, but with significantly more chainmail and fewer sunny afternoons. It was a world of constant raiding and counter-raiding, of blackmail payments known as black rent, paid to powerful Irish neighbors to keep the peace, and of shifting, pragmatic alliances that crossed the cultural divide. This was the landscape of medieval Ireland. Not one island, but two, locked in a difficult and often violent embrace. A division that would shape the conflicts and character of the centuries to come. For more than a century after the first invasion, the two islands, the colonial lordship and the Gaelic kingdoms, had been locked in their grinding, attritional stalemate. The colonists, secure behind the walls of their castles and towns, could not be dislodged, while the Gaelic Irish, masters of the wilder countryside, could not be conquered. By the early 1300s, the frontier had solidified, and the colony's expansion had long since ground to a halt. But across the narrow sea in Britain, events were unfolding that would send a seismic shockwave through this divided island. The great English king, Edward III, the Hammer of the Scots, was dead. His son, Edward II, was a far weaker and less effective ruler. Seizing this opportunity, the brilliant Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, had inflicted a catastrophic defeat on an English army at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, effectively securing Scotland's independence. But Robert knew the war was not over, and he began to think on a grander scale. He devised an audacious plan to open a second front against the English, a strategy built on the ancient cultural and linguistic links between the Gaels of Scotland and the Gaels of Ireland. He would attempt to unite them both against their common enemy. The man chosen to lead this daring enterprise was his only surviving brother, Edward Bruce. Edward was a renowned warrior, fierce and personally courageous, but he possessed all of his brother's towering ambition, with none of his patience or political savvy. He was the classic reckless younger brother, a man who saw a straight line to glory and was determined to charge down it, no matter the obstacles. The plan was for Edward to invade Ireland, rally the Gaelic chieftains, have himself declared High King, and squeeze the English between two hostile Celtic kingdoms. It was a spectacular gamble, and it found a ready audience among the Gaelic lords of Ulster, who lived on the front line of the conflict with the English colony. The most powerful of these lords, Domhnall O'Neill of Tyrone, formally invited Edward Bruce to Ireland to be their king. This was no mere backroom deal. In 1317, O'Neill and his allies sent a remarkable document to the Pope, a long and passionate letter known as the Remonstrance of the Irish Princes. It was a detailed and damning indictment of over a century of English rule in Ireland. It listed their grievances, how the colonists had broken every promise of justice, how they had stolen their lands, murdered their people, and, most pointedly, how the English legal system, which we remember from before, denied the native Irish any standing or protection. It was like a long, detailed, and furiously articulate letter of complaint to the landlord of the universe, arguing that since the English kings had so spectacularly failed to provide good governance, the Irish were entirely within their rights to choose a new king for themselves. In May of 1315, Edward Bruce landed near Larne in Ulster, with a small but battle-hardened army of Scottish veterans. He was immediately joined by O'Neill, who honorably stepped aside to support Bruce's claim to the High Kingship, and other northern chieftains. The effect was electric. Bruce was a superb field commander, and in the first year of his campaign, he tore through the unprepared colonial armies, winning a string of stunning victories at Kells, Skerries, and Kenlis. He marched south, leaving a trail of fire and destruction, his goal to shatter the economic heart of the English lordship. But his grand strategy was immediately complicated by a far greater and more indiscriminate power: the weather. The Bruce invasion coincided exactly with the beginning of the Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317, a catastrophic period of relentless rain, failed harvests, and mass starvation. The presence of two large armies marching across the land, consuming and destroying everything in their path, turned a natural disaster into an apocalypse. The Irish annals of these years are filled with horrific accounts of suffering, disease, and even cannibalism. The Scottish army, which had come as liberators, soon came to be seen by the starving common people as just another ravenous plague. Despite the horrific conditions, Bruce's military success continued. In 1316, he was formally inaugurated as High King of Ireland in a ceremony near Dundalk. For a brief moment, the grand band's Celtic dream seemed within his grasp, but his crown was a hollow one. He was king of a wasteland. His support among the wider Irish population was shallow, and his army was wasting away from hunger and disease. The Anglo-Norman colony, though battered to within an inch of its life, managed to rally its forces for one last stand under the command of John de Birmingham. At the Battle of Foghart in October 1318, Edward Bruce, in a final characteristic act of reckless impatience, led his starving army into battle against a superior force. Without waiting for all his Irish allies to arrive, he was killed in the opening charge. His body was dismembered, and his head was sent in a box to King Edward II of England. The great invasion was over, but although it had failed, Bruce's catastrophic campaign had succeeded in one thing. It had left the English colony in Ireland an absolute wreck, its economy shattered and its military power broken, inadvertently creating the perfect conditions for a Gaelic resurgence. The great Scottish invasion, for all its ultimate failure, had left the English lordship in Ireland like a fighter reeling from a knockout blow. The colony was on its knees, its economy in ruins, its military confidence shattered, and its territory visibly shrinking as opportunistic Gaelic lords nibbled away at its frontiers. For the next 3 decades, the Anglo-Norman barons were on the defensive, struggling to hold on to what they had. Their grand project of conquest, a distant and fading memory. The English crown, distracted by its long and costly wars in France, had few resources or attention to spare for its troubled Irish dominion. It seemed that the situation for the colonists could not possibly get any worse. But it was about to. In the summer of 1348, a new and infinitely more terrible enemy arrived. An enemy that no castle wall could stop and no army could fight. It came silently, carried on the fleas of the black rats that scurried down the mooring ropes of merchant ships docking in the ports of Dublin and Drogheda. The Black Death had arrived in Ireland. The pestilence that swept through the island was a horror on a scale that is difficult for us to comprehend. It was a swift and merciless killer, striking down the young and the old, the rich and the poor, with terrifying impartiality. Within days of infection, its victims would be overcome by high fevers, agonizing pain, and the grotesque swelling of the lymph nodes in the groin, neck, and armpits, the telltale buboes that gave the bubonic plague its name. A more virulent, pneumonic form spread directly from person to person through the air, and for those who contracted it, death was almost certain within a day or two. The towns of the English colony, with their narrow, crowded streets and primitive sanitation, became death traps. Fear and despair gripped the population as the social fabric disintegrated. Crucially, this terrible scourge did not fall upon the two islands equally. The Black Death was a fundamentally urban disease, one that thrived and spread most rapidly in densely populated areas. And it was the Anglo-Norman colonists who lived in such areas. Their society was built around market towns, port cities, and clustered manorial villages. Gaelic Ireland, by contrast, was an overwhelmingly rural and pastoral society. The native Irish lived in small, scattered family farmsteads, their population dispersed across the hillsides and valleys. In a grimly ironic twist, their more isolated, less commercially connected way of life provided a natural defense against the plague. While the towns of the Pale were being ravaged, the disease spread far more slowly and less destructively through the Gaelic heartlands. Geography and lifestyle had created a form of accidental but highly effective social distancing. We have a harrowing first-hand account of this devastation from a Franciscan friar named John Glynn, who was living in the colonial town of Kilkenny. In his annals, he documented the plague's terrifying advance, describing how it wiped out entire families, leaving houses empty and villages deserted. He watched as the cemeteries filled to overflowing and the dead were thrown into mass graves. I, he wrote, seeing these many ills and that the whole world is encompassed by the malign spirit, waiting for death till it come, have put into writing what I have truly heard and examined, and so that the writing may not perish with the writer, I leave parchment for continuing the work, if haply any man survive, and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence, and continue the work which I have begun. Friar Glynn recorded that in his own friary, he was the last man left alive out of 25. His final entry was made, it is believed, just before he, too, succumbed to the disease. His words are a haunting epitaph for the world he saw disappear before his eyes. The long-term consequences of the plague were profound. For the English colony, it was a demographic catastrophe from which it would never fully recover. Perhaps half of its population was wiped out in a few short years. The resulting labor shortage was so severe that crops rotted in the fields, and entire manors and settlements were simply abandoned, their stone walls slowly crumbling back into the landscape like a vast, unwanted real estate portfolio hitting a dead market. For the Gaelic Irish lords, however, the plague was seen as nothing short of a divine intervention. Their great enemy had been hollowed out from within by a force they could not have imagined. They had been handed the greatest military ally imaginable, and one that worked for free. As the colony reeled, the Gaelic clans swept down from the hills and woods, not just raiding, but reconquering huge swathes of their ancestral lands. The frontier collapsed inwards, and the territory under the control of the Dublin government began to shrink dramatically. The Black Death did not just kill people, it killed the momentum of the Norman conquest and created a power vacuum that would reshape the island's destiny. In the wake of the Bruce invasion and the Black Death, the Anglo-Norman colony in Ireland was a shadow of its former self. It was a shrinking, isolated, and demoralized outpost, whose connection to its parent kingdom of England was becoming more and more tenuous. For the descendants of the first conquerors, particularly the great lords, whose vast estates lay on the wild and dangerous frontiers, a stark choice presented itself. They could either remain aloof, clinging to an English identity that was becoming increasingly irrelevant to their daily survival, and risk being overwhelmed by the resurgent Gaelic world pressing in on all sides. Or they could adapt. They could engage with the culture of the majority, build alliances, and adopt the customs of the land they now called home. Over the course of the 14th century, a great many of them chose the latter, and in doing so, they began a remarkable transformation. This process became known as Gaelicization, and it was so profound that it gave rise to one of the most famous phrases in Irish history. The Anglo-Normans, it was said, had become Hiberniores Hibernis ipsis, more Irish than the Irish themselves. This wasn't a formal decision, but a slow, pragmatic, and generational drift. It was like a family that moves to a new country for a job opportunity. The first generation holds on to the old ways, but by the third, the grandchildren are speaking the local language with a perfect accent, have married local partners, and are complaining about the government just like their neighbors. For the great Hiberno-Norman lords, this meant embracing the core elements of Gaelic life, the Irish language, a tongue their ancestors had despised as barbaric, became the everyday language of their households and castles, often to the point where they could no longer speak English or Norman French. They wove themselves into the very fabric of Gaelic society through its two most important social institutions, marriage and fosterage. They began to ignore the church's prohibitions and made politically astute marriages with the daughters of powerful Gaelic chieftains, creating intricate webs of kinship and alliance that crisscrossed the old ethnic divide. Even more significantly, they adopted the powerful Gaelic custom of fosterage, sending their sons to be raised in the households of their new Irish allies. This created bonds of loyalty and affection that were often considered stronger than blood, ensuring a level of mutual trust that no mere treaty could provide. They adopted Gaelic laws, dress, and even hairstyles. And crucially, they adopted the Gaelic way of war. These lords became great patrons of Irish poets, who would compose epic odes to their greatness. And they maintained their power not with feudal levies of farmers, but with private armies of professional Irish and Scottish mercenaries, the Kern and the fearsome Galloglass. This transformation was embodied by the three greatest Hiberno-Norman dynasties, the Fitzgeralds, the Butlers, and the Dayburghs. The Fitzgeralds split into two main branches, the Earls of Kildare in Leinster and the Earls of Desmond in Munster. The Butlers became the Earls of Ormond, their power base centered in Kilkenny and Tipperary. And in Connaught, the Dayburgh family went so fully native that they dropped their Norman name entirely and became known by the Gaelic patronymic Macwilliam or Burke. These families were no longer acting as agents of the English crown. They had become semi-independent princes, ruling their vast territories as hybrid Gaelic lordships. They waged war, made treaties, and dispensed justice according to their own interests, often fighting against the king's official government in Dublin, just as fiercely as they fought against their Gaelic rivals. From the perspective of the English administration, huddled behind the defensive walls of Dublin, this process was viewed with absolute horror. In their eyes, their own people were going native. They saw the Gaelicization of the great lords not as a pragmatic adaptation, but as a form of cultural and racial degeneration. They were abandoning English civility, law, and language for what the Dublin officials saw as Irish barbarism. It was as if they had sent their children to a prestigious but distant boarding school, only for them to return years later, having completely rejected the family's values, preferring the strange customs and rough manners of the locals they had befriended. This perceived corruption of the English race in Ireland was seen as a mortal threat to the very existence of the colony. The Crown and its government in Dublin decided that this cultural drift could not be tolerated. If the colonists would not remain English by choice, they would be made to do so by force of law. The view from the English court in the mid-14th century was alarming. The once profitable and expanding lordship of Ireland, a jewel in the crown of the Angevin Empire, now seemed to be on the verge of total collapse. The reports arriving from the nervous administration in Dublin spoke of a colony not just shrinking in territory, but dissolving in its very identity, with its greatest lords abandoning English customs and language to become indistinguishable from the Gaelic chieftains they were supposed to be conquering. The powerful King of England, Edward III, a man forged in the brutal Hundred Years' War with France, was not one to let such a situation fester. He decided that a dramatic and forceful intervention was required to pull his wayward colony back from the brink. In 1361, he dispatched his own son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, to Ireland as the king's lieutenant. Lionel, who had a personal stake in the country through his wife's inheritance of the vast de Burgh lands, arrived with a fresh English army and a clear, uncompromising mission to stop the cultural rot and reimpose a pure, undiluted Englishness on the lordship. After several years of military campaigning with mixed results, Lionel turned to what he saw as the more fundamental problem: the cultural contamination of the colonists. In 1366, he summoned a great parliament of the loyal Anglo-Irish nobility and clergy to the town of Kilkenny, a settlement deep in the heart of the contested frontier lands. Here, in this bastion of the beleaguered colony, he promulgated a series of laws that would become infamous in Irish history: the Statutes of Kilkenny. These 35 articles were not just a legal code. They were a desperate and detailed attempt to construct a wall of cultural apartheid between the English and the Irish, to legislate every point of contact and assimilation out of existence. The statutes were breathtaking in their scope. They made it an act of high treason for any English colonist to marry an Irish person, to engage in the practice of fostering children with the Irish, or to stand as a godparent to an Irish child. They forbade the English from speaking the Irish language, from using Irish names for their children, from adopting Irish styles of dress, and even from riding a horse in the Irish fashion, without a saddle. They outlawed the use of Irish Brehon law among the colonists, demanding that all disputes be settled by English common law. The laws even extended to recreation, banning the English from playing the popular Irish sport of hurling. The cultural separation was to be absolute. English monasteries and cathedrals were ordered to never again accept an Irishman into their ranks. Selling horses or armor to an Irishman in a time of war was, again, declared to be high treason. Behind these laws lay a clear and uncompromising ideology. The government no longer saw the problem in Ireland as one of simple rebellion or political disloyalty. They saw it as a problem of racial and cultural purity. The statutes explicitly defined the population of the island as two separate and irreconcilable nations: the loyal English-born in Ireland and the hostile Irish enemies. B. The native Gaelic culture was viewed as a contagious disease, a corrupting influence that threatened the very soul of the English race. The goal was no longer to conquer and civilize the Irish. The goal was to quarantine them, to prevent their barbarous ways from infecting the good English stock of the colony. In practice, however, the statutes of Kilkenny were a spectacular failure. The Dublin administration, whose real power barely extended beyond a fortified coastal strip around the capital, simply did not have the means to enforce such a sweeping social re-engineering project. For the great Hiberno-Norman lords out on the marches, the Burkes, the Fitzgeralds, the Butlers, the laws were not just unenforceable, they were absurd. Their entire power base, their military strength, and their local political standing were built upon the very things the statutes forbade. Their kinship ties to Gaelic families, their private armies of galloglass, their pragmatic use of local customs. It was like a corporate head office issuing a new, ridiculously out-of-touch employee handbook forbidding fraternization with clients, when everyone knew the entire business ran on the personal relationships the frontier managers had built. The great lords simply ignored the laws and carried on as before. But while the statutes failed as a practical measure, they succeeded grimly as a declaration of intent. They officially ended any prospect of a peaceful fusion between the two cultures under the English crown. Instead, they enshrined division and hostility as the official policy of the state, a toxic legacy that would poison relations for centuries to come. The statutes of Kilkenny were a spectacular failure. They were a wall of words built against a tide of cultural fusion, and they were swept away almost as soon as they were written. In the century that followed, the authority of the English crown and its government in Dublin continued to wither, distracted by the seemingly endless Hundred Years' War with France, and increasingly plagued by political turmoil at home. English kings had little time, money, or manpower to spare for their struggling Irish lordship. The English colony shrank to a defensive fringe of territory around Dublin, a fortified zone that would eventually become known as the Pale. Into the vast power vacuum that now covered three-quarters of the island stepped the figures who would dominate late medieval Ireland, the great Hiberno-Norman earls. These were the descendants of the original conquerors who had ignored the statutes, embraced Gaelic culture, and now ruled their vast territories not as English barons, but as veritable kings. Three great dynasties came to dominate this new political landscape. First, and most powerful, were the two branches of the Fitzgerald family. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare held a strategic position, their lands bordering the English Pale in Leinster. They became masters of a delicate and profitable balancing act, presenting themselves to the king as loyal defenders of the colony, while behaving like Gaelic warlords in their own territory, drawing power from both worlds. Their southern cousins, the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, were based in Munster and were even more deeply Gaelicized, ruling as virtually independent princes in a landscape of shifting alliances with their Gaelic Irish neighbours. Their great rivals were the Butler family, the Earls of Ormond, whose power base was in Tipperary and Kilkenny. The Butlers, perhaps due to their closer family ties to the English royal house, traditionally styled themselves as the champions of English loyalty in Ireland, a position that placed them in a state of near-permanent and often violent opposition to the ambitions of the Fitzgeralds. The power of these great earls did not derive from royal charters issued by a distant king in London. It was built on the ground in Ireland through a combination of feudal and Gaelic practices. The true engine of their authority was the maintenance of large professional private armies, replete with the fearsome Galloglass axemen and fast-moving Kern skirmishers we've met before. To pay for these armies, they used a system of military extortion known as coin and livery. This was the practice of forcibly quartering troops and demanding supplies from the inhabitants of a territory, both English tenants and Gaelic subjects. It was completely illegal under English law and utterly ruinous for the poor farmers who had to endure it. But it gave the earls a military capability that the official Dublin government, with its tiny, underfunded garrison, could not hope to match. The central drama of Irish politics for the next century and a half would be the titanic feud between the two most powerful of these families, the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers. It was a rivalry that transcended mere politics, becoming a bitter, hereditary struggle for land, power, and prestige. A much deadlier and more consequential version of the Hatfields and McCoys. The two families and their vast networks of allies and dependent lords waged war on each other, plotted against each other at the English court, and competed ferociously for the ultimate prize, control of the Dublin administration itself. Faced with this new reality of these overmighty subjects, the English crown made a pragmatic, if ultimately fateful decision. Realizing it could no longer afford the cost of trying to rule Ireland directly against the will of these powerful magnates, it effectively decided to subcontract the job. This was a policy of home rule by another name. If you can't beat them, hire them. The king began to regularly appoint the head of one of the great families, usually the Earl of Kildare, or his rival, the Earl of Ormond, to the office of Chief Governor of Ireland, the Lord Deputy. The logic was simple, if cynical. It was better to have the most powerful lord on the island, keeping a semblance of order in the king's name, than to have no order at all. It was the political equivalent of a weary school principal making the biggest troublemaker in the class the hall monitor, in the desperate hope that he might at least keep the other bullies in line. This system created a strange, unstable Ireland, where the real power lay not with the king, but with his enormously powerful local deputies, whose loyalty was often conditional and whose ambitions were boundless. By the mid-15th century, the political ecosystem of Ireland had settled into a kind of stable instability. The great Hiberno-Norman earls, as we've seen, ruled their vast territories as kings in all but name, their power checked only by their rivals and the complex web of their Gaelic alliances. The authority of the English crown was a distant theoretical concept, a flickering candle in the grand, draughty hall of Irish politics. But that hall was about to be shaken by a dynastic storm from England itself, a brutal and chaotic 30-year civil war between two rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. This conflict, known to history as the Wars of the Roses, would not be a distant rumor in Ireland. It would turn the island into a key strategic battleground, a safe haven for exiled lords, and a king-making territory that would have a direct impact on who wore the crown of England. The bitter rivalries of England mapped almost perfectly onto the existing feuds of Ireland. The most powerful dynasty in the country, the Fitzgeralds of Kildare, and Desmond, threw their immense weight and prestige behind the cause of the White Rose of the House of York. It was almost inevitable then that their mortal enemies, the Butler Earls of Ormond, would become staunch and loyal supporters of the Red Rose of Lancaster. The private wars of the Irish magnates were suddenly given a new, higher stakes ideological dimension. Their armies of Galloglass and Kern were no longer just fighting for cattle or local prestige. They were fighting for the throne of England. Ireland became a crucial piece on the chessboard because it was the perfect rear base, a source of excellent soldiers, and a relatively safe place for a lord on the losing side to retreat, regroup, and plan his return to the fray. The deep connection between Ireland and the House of York was forged in 1449 with the arrival of the Yorkist leader himself, Richard, Duke of York. His Lancastrian rivals at court, hoping to neutralize his growing power and influence, had him appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a move they intended as a form of political exile. It was like being sent to manage a difficult, remote, and perpetually unprofitable branch office. But the plan backfired magnificently. Richard of York proved to be a charismatic and incredibly popular governor. He arrived with his pregnant wife, and his son, George, Duke of Clarence, was born in Dublin Castle, a detail that further endeared him to the local nobility. He treated the great lords, both Hiberno-Norman and Gaelic, not as troublesome inferiors, but as respected peers. He forged a deep and lasting personal bond with the Fitzgerald Earls, who became his devoted allies. He was seen as a ruler who understood and respected Irish autonomy. His governorship reached its political peak in 1460, when he presided over a parliament at Drogheda. This parliament, dominated by his Yorkist supporters, passed a stunning piece of legislation. It declared that the land of Ireland, while a dominion of the King of England, was a corporate entity separate from the realm of England itself. Therefore, it was bound only by those laws passed in its own Irish Parliament. This was a radical declaration of constitutional and legislative independence, a formal statement of the Home Rule the great earls had been practicing for a century. When Richard finally sailed from Ireland to press his claim to the English throne, he left not as an exile, but as a national hero, a man who commanded the fierce personal loyalty of the most powerful families on the island. For the next 25 years, Ireland was, for all intents and purposes, a Yorkist stronghold. The Fitzgeralds, who were die-hard fans of the White Rose, held the island for their cause with unwavering loyalty, even during periods when the Lancastrians had regained control in England. The Dublin government was entirely in their hands. This dominance was cemented on the battlefield. In 1462, at the Battle of Piltown in County Kilkenny, the Yorkist army of Thomas Fitzgerald, Earl of Desmond, met the Lancastrian army of the Butlers in one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought between the colonists in Ireland. The result was a crushing victory for the Fitzgeralds, a battle that broke the power of the Butlers for a generation and secured Ireland as a safe and loyal Yorkist fortress. The Wars of the Roses had supercharged the power of the Fitzgerald Earls. They were now accustomed to ruling Ireland with almost total independence, choosing which English king to obey, and acting as the arbiters of power. This supreme confidence, This habit of being the uncrowned kings of Ireland would soon be tested like never before, when the long and bloody war finally ended and a new, dangerously efficient dynasty took the English throne. In August 1485, on a muddy field at Bosworth in England, the long and bloody Wars of the Roses came to a decisive end. The Yorkist king, Richard III, was cut down, and a shrewd, calculating Welshman named Henry Tudor claimed the throne as King Henry VII. The new king's grip on power was tenuous, and as he surveyed his kingdom, one region stood out as a glaring and immediate threat: Ireland. While the White Rose of York had been trampled into the mud of Bosworth, in Ireland it was still in full bloom. The island was a Yorkist fortress, dominated by the powerful Fitzgerald dynasty, whose loyalty had been to the defeated king. The new Tudor monarch knew that until he had dealt with the problem of Ireland, his throne would never be truly secure. His fears were soon realized. A desperate and audacious plot was hatched by disgruntled Yorkist supporters in England. Led by a priest from Oxford, they found a handsome and well-mannered 10-year-old boy named Lambert Simnel. Simnel was the son of a tradesman, a complete unknown, but he had been coached to impersonate Edward, the young Earl of Warwick, a genuine Yorkist prince whom Henry VII had safely locked away in the Tower of London. The plan was audacious, if perhaps a little light on the background checks. They would present this boy as the rightful heir to the throne and launch a rebellion to restore the House of York. And they knew exactly where to find the money, soldiers, and political credibility to get their rebellion off the ground. They took a ship to Dublin. They arrived in Ireland to a rapturous reception. The leader of the Yorkist party, and the most powerful man in the country, was the formidable Gerald Fitzgerald, known as Garrett Moore, the great Earl of Kildare. He and the other lords of the Anglo-Irish Council listened to the plotter's story, and against all probability, chose to believe it. Historians still debate the Earl's motives. Was he a genuinely devoted Yorkist, duped by a clever conspiracy? Or was he a cynical political operator who knew perfectly well the boy was a fake, but saw him as the perfect pawn, a puppet king, through whom he could reassert his own power and Irish autonomy against the new, unknown Tudor monarch in London? Whatever the reason, Kildare and the entire Dublin establishment threw their full weight behind the pretender. What followed was one of the most surreal and defiant acts in Irish history. On the 24th of May, 1487, in a magnificent ceremony in Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral, the 10-year-old commoner, Lambert Simnel, was crowned King of England and Lord of Ireland, with the title of King Edward II. Lacking a proper royal crown, a golden circlet was borrowed from a nearby statue of the Virgin Mary and placed upon his head. He was anointed and acclaimed by the assembled lords and bishops of Ireland, and then paraded through the streets of the city, hoisted high on the shoulders of the tallest man in the country. It was a stunning act of collective treason, a theatrical and audacious declaration that the nobility of Ireland, not the King of England, would decide who was the rightful ruler. But crowning a king was the easy part. Placing him on the actual throne of England was another matter. The Earl of Kildare, now the chief minister of this new boy king, assembled an invasion force. It was a motley but dangerous army, consisting of a corps of his own Hiberno-Norman knights and retainers, a large contingent of lightly armed Gaelic Irish kern, and for extra military punch, a force of 2,000 veteran German and Swiss mercenaries hired with money from the continent. This Irish-German army landed in the north of England in early June 1487 to begin their conquest. They found little support. The people of England were weary of war and suspicious of an army of Irishmen and Germans. King Henry VII, who was anything but a fool, was ready for them. At the Battle of Stoke Field, Henry's large, well-equipped, and professionally led army met the invaders. The result was a slaughter. The unarmored Irish kern were cut to pieces by English longbows, and the German mercenaries were eventually overwhelmed. The Yorkist rebellion was crushed in a single, bloody afternoon. The leaders of the plot were killed or captured. But Henry VII's treatment of the boy king himself was a masterstroke of political genius and royal sarcasm. Instead of executing Lambert Simnel, Henry recognized that the boy was a mere pawn and gave him a full pardon. He then gave him a job in the royal household as a scullion, a boy who turned the roasting spit in the palace kitchens. The great rebellion that had begun with a coronation in a cathedral ended with its king working as a kitchen porter. It was a calculated move to make the entire enterprise, and by extension, its Irish backers, look utterly ridiculous. The great Earl of Kildare had been deeply humiliated, but Henry was still not strong enough to punish him directly. The king had sent a clear message, but the most powerful man in Ireland remained in place, and the tense relationship between the Tudor crown and the House of Kildare was far from over. The Lambert Simnel affair had been a spectacular and embarrassing farce for the great Earl of Kildare, Garrett Moore Fitzgerald. He had backed the wrong horse, crowned a fake king, and sent an army to its destruction. Yet, when the dust settled, the new Tudor king, Henry VII, was faced with a maddening paradox. The Earl of Kildare was a proven traitor who had tried to depose him, but the Earl of Kildare was also the only man in Ireland with the power, prestige, and network of alliances necessary to actually govern the country without it costing the English exchequer a fortune. Henry, a man who valued his treasury above almost all else, was a pragmatist. His first move was not to destroy Kildare, but to try and contain him. In 1494, he recalled the Earl and sent a tough and loyal English administrator, Sir Edward Poynings, to take over as Lord Deputy, with a mandate to bring the rogue lordship to heel. Poynings' most lasting achievement was to convene a parliament at Drogheda that passed a piece of legislation that would echo through Irish history. Poynings' Law. This famous statute was a direct assault on the legislative independence that the Irish Parliament had asserted during the Yorkist era. It decreed that from now on, no parliament could even be held in Ireland without the English king's prior permission. Furthermore, any laws it proposed to pass had to be submitted to the king and his council in England for approval before they could even be debated. In a single stroke, the Irish Parliament was shackled to the English government, its legislative power reduced to a mere rubber stamp. The message was clear. The days of Irish Home Rule were over, but passing a law in the relative safety of the Pale was one thing. Enforcing English authority in the rest of Ireland was another. Poynings' tenure was a costly and frustrating failure. His English army was bled dry in inconclusive campaigns against Gaelic lords, and he quickly discovered that he could not control the country without the cooperation of the very Hiberno-Norman magnates he was supposed to be reining in. For the penny-pinching Henry VII, the experiment in direct rule was becoming a financial disaster. Reluctantly, he acknowledged the reality of the situation. He summoned Garrett Moore back to the English court to answer charges of treason, where a legendary, if perhaps polished, exchange is said to have occurred. As his enemies listed his crimes, one exasperated bishop declared, "All Ireland cannot rule this man," to which King Henry, with a flash of cynical genius, is said to have replied, "Then in that case, this man must rule all Ireland." It was the ultimate pragmatic decision, like a frustrated IT manager realizing the only way to keep the network from crashing is to give full admin privileges to the one rogue employee who actually knows how all the legacy systems work. Garrett Moore was reappointed as Lord Deputy, and for the next 20 years, until his death in 1513, the Kildare supremacy reached its zenith. He was the uncrowned King of Ireland. He masterfully used the official authority of his royal office as a cloak for the expansion of his own family's power. He used the king's armies to crush his personal enemies, particularly the butlers, and used his vast network of Gaelic alliances, cemented by marriage and fosterage, to keep the peace in the rest of the country. It was the ultimate work-from-home job, with minimal supervision, a huge expense account in the form of royal revenues, and the freedom to pursue his own corporate strategy. As long as Ireland remained quiet and, most importantly, cheap, Henry VII was content to let him rule. This golden age continued when Garrett Moore was succeeded by his equally charismatic and capable son, Garrett Og, the ninth Earl. But the political climate across the sea had changed dramatically. The cautious, businesslike Henry VII was gone, and his son, Henry VIII, was now on the throne. The new king was young, arrogant, and had a vastly different concept of monarchy. He was building a new, centralized, and absolutist Tudor state, and his ambitious ministers, like the powerful Cardinal Wolsey, had no patience for the idea of an overmighty subject, like Kildare, running a kingdom as his personal fiefdom. The old informal arrangement began to break down. Garrett Og was repeatedly summoned to London to answer for his high-handed actions, his private wars, and his suspiciously close relationships with the king's Irish enemies. The new, assertive Tudor monarchy and the proud, semi-independent House of Kildare were now set on a collision course. The long, glorious reign of the uncrowned kings was drawing to a close, and its end would be as sudden and as violent as its rise. The tense and distrustful relationship between the assertive new Tudor monarchy and the powerful, semi-independent Earls of Kildare was a political fault line running through the heart of the Irish lordship. By the 1530s, that fault line was about to rupture. Garrett Og, the ninth Earl, was summoned to London in 1534 to answer for his conduct, a now familiar ritual of royal displeasure. But this time was different. The political winds in Henry VIII's court had turned decisively against him. Sensing the immense danger, Garrett Og left the governance of his lands and the leadership of his vast network of allies in the hands of his charismatic but dangerously hot-headed 21-year-old son and heir, Lord Thomas Fitzgerald, known to history as Silken Thomas. Back in London, Garrett Og was arrested and sent to the Tower. Soon after, his enemies in Ireland deliberately spread a false rumour that the old Earl had been summarily executed. For Silken Thomas, this was the final provocation. Believing his father to be dead and his family's destruction imminent, he decided on a course of open and spectacular defiance. On the 11th of June, 1534, in a scene of high drama, Thomas and his retainers, their helmets adorned with the silken fringe that gave him his nickname, rode to St. Mary's Abbey in Dublin, where the King's Council was meeting. There, he stormed into the chamber, publicly renounced his allegiance to King Henry VIII, and in a grand theatrical gesture, threw the ceremonial sword of state down on the table. It was a magnificent, passionate, and utterly catastrophic act of political suicide. A classic case of acting first and thinking about the consequences much, much later. The rebellion was, at first, a spectacular success. The Dublin government was caught completely off guard, and soon Silken Thomas and his allies controlled almost the entirety of the English Pale. But his crucial failure to capture the heavily fortified Dublin castle, combined with his politically disastrous decision to murder the Archbishop of Dublin, who had taken refuge there, began to turn the tide against him. And the response from England was unlike any that had come before. Henry VIII was not sending a rival baron to fight a medieval war. He was deploying the full force of the modern Tudor state. A new English army was dispatched under the command of Sir William Skeffington, and with it came a weapon that would signal the end of an entire era of warfare in Ireland. A train of heavy siege artillery, the symbolic end of the Old World, came in March of 1535 at the siege of Maynooth Castle, the primary and most powerful fortress of the Fitzgerald dynasty. For centuries, such castles had been the ultimate expression of power, their thick stone walls immune to the attacks of traditional Irish armies. But against Skeffington's heavy cannons, they were terrifyingly vulnerable. For 2 weeks, the great guns battered the fortress, smashing its walls to rubble. The surviving garrison, seeing the futility of their position, eventually surrendered, possibly on the understanding that their lives would be spared. But the age of chivalry was over. In an act of calculated ruthlessness, Skeffington had almost the entire garrison systematically put to the sword. This massacre became known with grim Tudor irony as the Pardon of Maynooth. It was a clear and brutal message to every lord in Ireland. Your castles can no longer protect you, and the old rules of war no longer apply. The rebellion crumbled. Silken Thomas, now a hunted fugitive, eventually surrendered in August 1535 on the promise of a royal pardon. The promise was worthless. He and his 5 uncles, who had also been implicated in the rebellion, were shipped to London and imprisoned in the Tower. The old Earl, Garrett Og, had already died of illness in his cell. In February of 1537, Henry VIII broke his word, and Silken Thomas and his 5 uncles were all brutally executed at Tyburn by hanging, drawing, and quartering. In a single day, the main male line of the great house of Kildare, the uncrowned kings of Ireland for 3 generations, was wiped out. This was more than just the crushing of a rebellion. It was the end of an age. The old medieval system of ruling Ireland through powerful, semi-independent Hiberno-Norman magnates was dead. The Tudor monarchy was now committed to a new, far more direct and aggressive policy: the complete military conquest and colonization of the entire island, a process that would be fueled by the new and bitter passions of the Protestant Reformation. The long, complicated, and often surprisingly fluid world of medieval Ireland was over. A new, and in many ways harsher story was about to begin, and so our long journey through the medieval world of Ireland comes to its quiet end. The grand, turbulent story of saints and Vikings, of Norman knights and Gaelic kings, of great earls and forgotten wars, now fades into the gentle quiet of the past. The world we have walked through for so long is gone now, its fierce passions cooled, its bitter conflicts silenced by the centuries. All that remains are the echoes and the whispers, the memories that are held in the land itself. You can feel them in the deep silence of a monastic ruin at Glendalough, see them in the stark and lonely profile of a stone castle at Trim, and hear them in the wind that blows across the ancient stones of Tara. The world of Brian Boru and Strongbow, of St. Malachy and Silken Thomas, has vanished, its vibrant and violent life receding into the soft green hills and the dark, quiet earth. The great story is over. The last page has been turned, and the book is now closed. All is quiet. There is only the stillness of the past, 1,000 years of history, resting peacefully under the stars, waiting for the gentle oblivion of a good night's sleep.